me, computer, please. Yeah, here you go. I know I can fix that. And I should have. I'm good. I don't do well under pressure. Most of you perhaps have figured that out by now. There we go. Save. I want to try this. He says he in this he says in time past he spake to the fathers by the prophets. Now this time past conveys two meanings, and the, the 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 basic word that you see here simply means old, and the Greek has two words that mean old, and it means old, and it meaning old in point of time, but the word that's used here is old in point of use, so that he's suggesting the idea that it's worn out in time. It's not just a matter of saying it's old, it's saying it's worn out, it's ready to be displaced by something new. And of course, as you follow through in the book of Hebrews, you'll find that that's the thing that he wants to convey. Uh, it's obvious by the choice of word that he makes that he's suggesting this idea of use. It's not just that it's old and worn out. So the time past that it's referring to, it wasn't ready to be cast aside. For instance, over in, what is it, chapter 8, he says something more of that. He says in verse 13, in that he saith, a new covenant he hath made the first old. Now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. And so even here in this first verse, he's giving that connotation that it's worn out. He says in different. I mentioned to you that in the Greek it's reversed, but the next idea is God. And we could talk about this a lot. I don't know how much you want to talk about it. The use of the term. It's a reference, obviously, to the people who are reading this. I think that it was an attempt to draw the writer into some sort of harmony with his readers, so that they're worshiping the same God. He's not referring to Allah or Buddha or some other notion of God, the grand architect of the universe, of the Masons, but he's speaking to them to draw them in, I believe, to the same God that they're worshiping. And there's two. It's interesting. He says God spake, but there's two words here. There's God spake in verse 1, and then there's God spoke in verse 2 to convey both of those, so that it's obvious there's two revelations. God spake in the Old Testament, and then he spake or spoke in the New Testament as well. And so the two are joined together. He says he spoke to Israel, or spoke in time past unto the fathers. The word that's used there is the word for patriarchs by the prophets. And that's, you get the word patriarchal age from that. There's a distinction between the patriarchal age, and there's a distinction between that and the Mosaical age. The things commanded of the patriarchs were commanded of one individual, to one family. It's not a command usually to all mankind. For instance, anybody want to cite a for instance? Okay, Abraham offering Isaac. Abraham was also told to leave Ur of the Chaldees. Didn't tell everybody in Ur to leave, just Abraham. Noah was commanded to build an ark. That doesn't mean other people have to build an ark. Noah was commanded to do so. But then, you go ahead. You started. That's true. That's a good point. Uh, he said he spoke to Moses. Uh, it's interesting that the tense of the word used here, the word that's used, suggests an idea of sphere. It is, if you want to know, it's locative of sphere. That is, God spoke to the prophets, not to anybody else. So that the prophets were the group to whom he spoke. It wasn't widespread. Thus, the preposition that's used here, he spoke unto the fathers by the prophets. The preposition by that's used there is instrumental. It's in an instrumental case. So that the prophets were instruments of God. So that he spoke by the prophets. Now you see some couple of interesting references to this that I think that might be interesting to you. First of all, let's talk about a prophet. What is a prophet? A lot of people don't have the foggiest notion of what a prophet is. A lot of people think that a prophet was somebody who was like a fortune teller who was telling people about the future. And of course, there were some instances where they did talk about the future, but a prophet was the outspeaker. He was the one who spoke the will of God, period. Now, sometimes it was the will of God to speak about the future, and so he prophesied the future. But the vast majority, if you've studied the prophets, I know the most recent study we've made of it, Alan, I think, studied through, I think, all of the prophets with us. It's obvious that an enormous amount of that material is not fortune telling, it's not future telling. It's simply God speaking to the people of the time. And it's interesting, if you look with me in John 1 and verse 23, you'll see one such instance that perhaps you hadn't considered. He said, this is the record of John, verse 19, when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who art thou?" And he answers them and says in verse 23, "I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as said the prophet Isaiah." John was the voice, the one in that verse. I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness is God. So that John is the prophet of God. John is the outspeaker. I am the voice. So God was using him. He was merely the articulate voice of God. He was an instrument in God's hands, God speaking through him. And he was not the one crying in the wilderness. God was the one crying in the wilderness. And he was speaking through John. The revelation, let's go on to verse 2. He hath in these last days spoken unto us, and by the way, we may go back over this if I have time enough this evening. I don't even know what time of day it is. Hath in these last, why did I put this sweater on and you turned up Nebuchadnezzar's furnace? Having a hot flash here. Hath in these last days spoken unto us by, and if you'll note, I'm reading out of the King James. The his is added for grammar's sake or for understanding's sake, but it is spoken unto us by Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds. This indicates that God did not just speak by his Son, but that the revelation was of his Son, what the Son was, not merely in what he said. It was not primarily a revelation given by words, but it was a revelation given by a personality. You know, everything he said and did, he reflected the Father. For instance, he says in other places, in John 14:9, he that hath seen me hath seen the Father. It was a revelation of his person. Everybody in the back is fanning. What's the temperature in here? I would blame it on those women, you know, but I'm hot too. It's what? You've turned on the air conditioner. I'll get gripes from Rita about the air conditioner. Turn off the heat. Woo! Is that what it is? This book was written to prove one thing, and I think that's important. We tried to cover that as I introduced the book. The book is written to prove that the New Testament is superior to and takes the place of the First Testament. And his first argument is here in chapter 1:1 and goes through chapter 8 and verse 6, and shows that the founder of the New Testament is superior to the founders of the Old Testament. And he starts doing that in these two verses. He says he's superior to the prophets. You've got that revelation of the prophets. He's going to go on to show that he's superior to Moses, but that the founder of the New Testament is superior to the founders of the Old Testament. When the prophets spoke, it was merely as mouthpieces, prophets. When the Son spoke, we're told it was God himself that spoke. And that's one of the things that he's trying to prove here. When he uses the word hath, I keep reading, hath in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things. I'll come back to that in a little while. By whom also he made the worlds. This is usually a word that denotes a secondary agency, one working through another. And by the way, if you do talk with some groups, Jehovah's Witnesses and others who deny the deity of Jesus, or at least the eternal deity of Jesus, they will argue with you about this verse because of the use of that word, by whom he made the worlds. They'll argue that he was an agent, but it is sometimes used to speak of God's direct agency. So that Jesus is here being presented is not just an instrument, but as a cooperating agent. For instance, in Colossians 1, Paul makes the statement that all things, Colossians 1 verse 16, all things were created in him and through him. The expression in him makes and completes the expression through him that's in Colossians 1:16. Lightfoot says of it, in him indicates that all the laws and purposes which guide creation and govern the universe reside in him as their meeting point. All right. I've talked a lot. Let's look at the word worlds. The word worlds is a real argumentative thing. Yes. I'll get there eventually as I kick up another Bible here. What verse were you? I hate to argue with you. I like to argue. I don't believe. Uh, I believe it is true that Jesus existed from eternity. I'd go to Micah 5 and verse 2 to establish that. This passage, I believe, is talking about wisdom. And as verse 1 says, does not wisdom cry? And that's the thing that was possessed by God. Okay. I understand. I'll look at it again. I've looked at Proverbs 8 before, but I'll look at it again. That's an interesting thought. No, I never am. The word worlds that's here is the word eon. And it is more, a lot of people say, well, that's the universe. But it's not exact. It's more than the universe. It's God's revelation of himself in time and in space, so that it's throughout all time, throughout all space, and it's not exactly a reference to the physical universe, but it conveys the idea of the thought of the times and the ages through which this plan of God was unfolding. I like to study a book on Hebrews by whose name I just immediately forgot, Robert Milligan, who wrote another book which is brilliant By the way, his commentary on Hebrews is brilliant as well. But I forgot the title of it. Anyway, I'll remember it. 3 o'clock tonight, and I'll call all of you. It's amazing how those things come and go. Making it so doesn't help. But it's the idea of the plan of God as it was unfolded. It's more than just the physical universe. It is the plan of God as it is unfolding. He made the worlds. It's not just that he made the planets. It's not just that he made the physical universe, but he made everything the way it is now. He brought all this to be. He brought, it was part of the plan of God to save mankind. It was his perception of things. It's the way he made us. It's the way he understands us. So it's a lot bigger than just, well, he made the planets and those stars that are a long way off. So the Son in this is the agent in this process. God is making these things by the Son, or alongside the Son, with the Son. So it's not just that he created the Son, but he created the world as it exists. And you see that in some other places. You undoubtedly are thinking right now about the first chapter of John and the first few verses. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him. Without him was not anything made that was made. Now that again refers not just to the physical universe, but it refers to this plan of God, this unfolding plan of God that can be traced throughout the Old Testament and brought to pass today. Let's see. Get some more notes here. Possibly be patient. Oh my. I never will finish this. To me, it's such an interesting thing. For centuries, early centuries, there was a tremendous argument about these passages. We'll see more of that as we go on. The argument being made was that Jesus is here, in referring to him as the Son of God, was referring to him as a created being. We'll see more of that later on. And when it says in verse 2, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom he made the worlds. Perhaps you are aware that Jesus is not called the Son of God, in fact, until he comes into the world. He's called the Son of God by virtue of his birth by Mary, that virgin birth. He's called the Son of God in Psalms, the 2nd chapter, to refer to his resurrection and the place to which God has exalted him. But he isn't really called the Son of God until that time. You can look, for instance, at 2 or 3 passages uh, in Romans 1 and verse 4. Paul says 2 things. He says he was made of the seed of David. That's verse 3, I believe. He was made of the seed of David according to the flesh, referring to his human nature, and declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by his resurrection from the dead. So how then, in this passage and a couple of others, is Jesus, or is the Son being said to make the worlds? You know, John 1, when we read it, said the Word created the earth. This passage is saying the Son made the worlds. And may I suggest that there are instances in the Bible, several of them, where it is common to use the name or title of a person that who acquires that name or title at a later period in life and apply it when you write of it earlier. A couple of examples. We oftentimes, and the Bible oftentimes, speaks of Abraham, that Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees. That's technically not true. Abraham is not given the name Abraham for about 29 years after he left Ur. Until that time, he's called Abram. But you and I commonly talk about Abraham leaving Ur of the Chaldees. We also oftentimes speak of Paul and his vision of Christ on the road to Damascus. Paul didn't see that. His name was changed later. He was Saul on the road to Damascus. And we speak of Peter being called by the Lord as one of his apostles. But Peter wasn't called as one of his apostles. Simon was. Wasn't given the name Peter until Matthew the 18th chapter, 16th chapter, 16 is what. So it's a fairly common thing to do that. The phrase Son of God is applied to Christ primarily to refer to his divine nature, his divine being. I'm laughing at myself and I knew as I studied this that I would never make it. Yes. Well, okay. You have several controversies over the centuries. The Arian controversy is one of the first that you need to realize that was in the first 4 or 5 centuries you could read about. The Arians believed that Basically, there was only one being in the Godhead, reflected by three personalities. The modern day Pentecostals really take the same position. And yes, I think that passage, let us make man in our image, they do have a quibble over that. The words that's used there, they argue that that is a majestic use of the pronoun. As in, when the Queen of England christens a ship, let us christen the battleship, whatever, I was going to say Bismarck, but that's another country. The battleship Prince of Wales, which I think was ships. But it's the Pentecostals would argue that it's a majestic. So now, what a lot of I'm going to be clear. What a lot of people argue, a lot of brethren argue, and we can talk about it as we talk about the meaning of the term God. It's over there, word theologian, but it's nearly all the time used in the Bible. For instance, it's the word God over there in Genesis 1 is Elohim. It is the word. They have some quibbles on that too, but it is a good point to make. And I feel I've confused you. I'll try to do a little better next week and get my thoughts a little more concise. This is I know these seem like easy passages, but they've been argued about for centuries, believe it or not. And it is a very profound passage that Paul is starting off with. Thank you for listening. If you can get a hold of a copy by that commentary by Milligan on Hebrews, it's a very good commentary. And it will be one that, if you have any sense, you will keep almost all your life in your library. You could probably get it online somewhere, maybe cheap or free. Probably free, I think you can get it online now. What? He wrote a commentary on Hebrews.